Welcome to another episode of A Idol Podcast, the podcast where I give a weekly book review. This week, I read The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. The Time Machine is a science fiction piece that is a tale of a successful trip into the future via a time machine. It details the fate of humanity as well as the mechanics of time traveling. But overall, it really just evokes classic curiosity of what the future will hold for the human race. Herbert George Wells released The Time Machine in 1895 when he was just 29 years old. He's often referred to as the sci-fi pioneer because of The Time Machine, as well as the release of his other works, such as War of Worlds and The Invisible Man. Now, The Time Machine has a few different editions or versions. Mainly, it has to do with editing. They're not abundantly different, but there is the Holt edited version, the Heinemann edited version, as well as two extended versions that were released by the Dover Press, as well as the Easton Press. Now, the reason there are extended versions is mainly due to a push to lengthen the book, as it is only 86 pages. And so that extra bit of information is considered the deleted 13th chapter. And it is in those extended editions, but it was also released on its own. I would say, however, the version that I have, if you're watching visually, you can see right here, it didn't have that extra little bit of info, but from what I've read, it's or from what I've researched, I should say, it's just extra details and context for a situation that did happen in the book. It really doesn't change anything, so you can try to seek out an extended version, but it really doesn't matter. So now this book is set in England in the late 19th century, all the way up to the year 802,701. That is over 800,000 years into the future, just for context. And we don't get like a whole timeline of that time period from the 19th century up until that point, but that's, the year we jump to. And then we also get future Earth up until the end of time. And so that's again with the time traveler jumping around a little bit. So we do land in a few places, and we get a different, setting with each of those places, I should say. Physically, the location doesn't change, but, obviously with time, geography, it's different. Now, literary devices. Right when we jump into the story, we get a framed narrative. What that means is that we have a story within a story. So we're brought into this in the mind of one of the time traveler's friends. So we're already kind of, I would say, in an audience position, and we're just looking at the story from that. But also at the same time, when the time traveler starts to recount his tale, he's speaking in first person, and he speaks for probably 95% of the book. And so even though we're not in his mind, we're not following him, it's still a first person narrative. So the majority of the book, I would say, is entirely first person. So you're experiencing it through memories with the time traveler, and then as well as through our narrator, who is just watching him tell what happened. So I would say it's pretty easy to follow because you kind of feel like you're there, even though obviously you weren't. Now, themes, my favorite. So this was a fun one, mainly because I would say a lot of the themes were so overt that I almost didn't think of them at first. Part of the downside, I would say, of trying to actively read all the time is that you're always looking for a deeper meaning when, it's pretty obvious, for example, that one of the themes is time traveling, that's kind of where our whole plot revolves around, is the debate on whether or not time travel is possible. And then if we even get past that debate, how do we do that? And then What if this time machine isn't adequate enough? Things like that. That was a really in your face one. Now, also, I would say another overt theme, for me at least, is skepticism. And that's just because I feel like we're getting it from all sides. Let me explain. So, first, we get skepticism through the time traveler himself by him explaining that these quote unquote limitations that we've been told the human race has that bars us from time traveling doesn't exist. He's almost questioning the boundaries of math and geometry and physics. And so he's already skeptical of, half the stuff that we have been told is a fact. And this, of course, leads to discovery and leads to a new path, a new inventions. And so it's a healthy level of skepticism. However, with the narrator, he's trying to figure out if time travel is even possible. Okay, so he's still stuck on that. So he's skeptical of the claim. And then in the audience, we're skeptical of this whole thing because one, is time travel possible? And two, is he crazy? So we're just kind of like really hesitant around this whole plot. And so I feel like that's a big part of this book. And the reason I picked up on this is because I had to keep reminding myself that this was released in 1895. And for me, I don't know why I just associate being skeptical about things with modern thinking. And so I didn't realize that this was for a book to be published about this, a fantasy book, for people to read this, recreationally, about questioning, the basic laws of math and whatnot. It was really interesting to me. I love that it's like not everyone was blindly accepting the way of the world. Even though we haven't proven that time travel is possible yet, over 100 years later, I think it's really neat that this was released in 1895 and it has this level of, questioning the norm. So another theme I have here is humanity, and not just the word humanity, but civilization. And so all of that kind of combined into one. This is because when the time traveler does get to the year 802,701, he's using measurements of humanity to gauge, his interactions, as well as, what has happened here. And so the tools that the time traveler uses when assessing these two groups of species that we'll talk about in just a second are, for example, the buildings. So one of the first things that he looks for when he gets to this place is, where are the buildings? Where are they eating? Where are they sleeping? How big are they? How grand are they? What do they look like? Do they have rooms like us? And so this all kind of is going on in his mind to determine an overall picture of how they are living, as well as language, how complex it is, how long it's going to take him to pick up on the language so that he can accomplish what he needs to out of this trip, as well as burden. And this is a big one. So burden as far as what drives, these beings. Why do they wake up every morning? Do they have to wake up and make sure they complete some task so that they eat today? Is someone going out, for example, this doesn't apply to this story, but is someone herding the cattle, or things like that? And so without burden, people become very still and there's not really much purpose, and they become weak. And so that was a really big deciding factor here. It's, what are they doing all day? What are they fighting against? What are they rallying against? As well as the knowledge of the past and the future, which to us right now probably means what's being recorded. What do they know of? Maybe even the people in the 19th century. Do they have books around? One of the main things that we look for when we're looking through ancient ruins is records. Are there hieroglyphics somewhere? Like, We need some type of indication that there was life before us, as well as, are there any predictions? A lot of times people in present day quote the Mayan calendar, predicting when the world ends, blah, blah, blah. Where are they with that? Do they know of anything other than the life that they are currently living? As well as the last one I would say is measuring the self-preservation. And this is something that's it's kind of subtle in the sense that if something were to break your norm, how are you going to combat that? And here, one of the characters caught a leg cramp, and that almost proved fatal because she just kind of sat there and was just gonna let it happen, even though a leg cramp can be solved with just massaging your leg or maybe sitting down or stretching or something, And so this tiny thing indicates a larger picture of these beings don't know how to, or don't have the will to fight for themselves. And so this is a measure of civilization, and it's really holding these beings up against what the time traveler had known at that time to try to gauge, how far humanity had come. Of course, he's going into this thinking that he is going to encounter a group of beings that is so far advanced, that maybe he's going to have to catch up. But that was not the case. And so these were the few pillars of civilization that I believe he used to gauge, where humanity was at that point. Another thing that comes into play when we're talking about civilization is the degeneration theory by Ray Lankester. This is a theory that was popular in the 18th and the 19th centuries, and it's basically saying humans will devolve over time, losing intelligence, purpose, and complexities. And so this is it's very well displayed in this story. Now, Lancaster wrote Degeneration, a chapter in Darwinism in 1880, and so it was about 15 years or so before this book came out. But as we're going to talk about these two groups of beings here, I would definitely say one of these classes exemplifies that to a T. So in here, classes is a big thing because through the inference of the time traveler, we're able to track how classes change as time goes on. So we're familiar right now with socioeconomic classes. So wealth, how much wealth do you have, or what do you contribute to society? What is your job? That has evolved to positions of necessity. So with these beings, it was, okay, someone needs to make the clothes, someone needs to lead, someone needs to hunt, all that other stuff. This ultimately led to a hunter and a prey class explicitly. Just those two, you don't fall in between, you're either one or the other. So the prey in this instance are the Eloi, and I don't know if I'm saying that right, but it's spelled E-L-O-I, Eloi, I don't know. But these are very passive creatures who are elegant, they're very simple-minded, weak, and ignorant. They just really don't know anything other than the life that they are living. These are the species that completely encompass the degeneration theory. They have devolved to beings without a purpose, They eat, but they don't know where their food comes from. So, in my mind, I'm like, okay, what happens if it stops coming? They have no idea. And so it will be very easy to wipe out the species. Then we have the Morlocks, who are assumed to be an evolved working class. They literally work underneath the Eloi. They're very brutish. They have strength. They can be seen as the quote-unquote antagonist, but they're really just the aggressor in this sense. They are what is pushing this cycle of life, this cycle of humanity, because the Eloi don't really do anything. And so it's up to the Morlocks to kind of keep this going, They provide them with the clothes, they provide them with the food, and in turn, they eat them. But, everyone has to give something, so... But they also have, just from being basically essential workers. They have evolved to essentially working completely in the dark. They have a very high light sensitivity, but they really are the workers of this community. You know, they do everything. Now, moving on to motifs, I found one motif in particular being fire or heat. And that is because the fire, when the time traveler is in this foreign place, represents protection and comfort, because the fire wards off the Morlocks. So because they have a light sensitivity, you know, anything bright kind of, they can't handle it. And so the sun is their only enemy. And so that's often seen as a kind of a comfort for our time traveler, if only for a second, you know, but it does help him get his bearings and gather his confidence. But also, interestingly enough, the sun is brought up a lot, and that's because, you know, we're using the sun to dictate if it's day or night. But also the sun provides a familiar point of reference for the time traveler, because when the sun is no longer visible, that essentially means that human beings are completely extinct. You know, there's nothing left that came from humans. That's it. It's gone. And we can see this after he jumps forward a few more thousand years, where there are no creatures present and it's just dark, you know. And so it's assumed that either the sun burned out, or maybe the earth moved away from the sun or something like that. But that's kind of like the end game, you know, for human beings. That's the end of it. And so the sun being a really integral part in the human life cycle is something that is certainly brought up in this book. Now, lastly, being that this is a classic, it has classic status. So I did go into this book with the intention of proving why it was a classic. And it's very kind of obvious, being that it was written so long ago. You know, it's almost like the first of its kind. It's something that popularized time traveling theories. And speaking in 2021, you know, that's something that we probably talk about very casually today, but that's not an idea or a notion that probably went well with people when it was brought up. As we can see in this book, even him explaining and showing proof of time travel, it didn't go well with his peers, and they thought he was crazy. And so just this idea of bringing up time traveling and talking about it, that alone sets this book apart. And the fact that it can maintain its popularity even now, probably due to the fact that we haven't figured out time travel yet, but it's still kind of like the blueprint for time traveling fantasy novels, as well as it being that it addresses social degeneration. And I say this because I think everyone is really afraid, even if they don't know what social degeneration means. Everyone's just afraid of that. No one wants humanity to become this simple species that doesn't really have a purpose. They don't do anything, you know, whatever. And so I think a lot of times, even like with like religious groups or organizations, people appeal to that. They're like, okay, you need to do this, this, and this so that humanity doesn't turn into nothing. You know what I mean? So I think that even just addressing that kind of that weak spot in a lot of people's minds is something that pulls, you know, an audience in, because it's essentially giving humanity a warning, you know, like diversity in jobs and economics and things like that. It's necessary, you know. Having the ability to push yourself past obstacles is what keeps you strong. And just pulling from a personal standpoint, this is not necessarily in the book, but recognizing that aligning yourself so that you have nothing left to conquer around you will only weaken you. So even just on like a professional level, like that gives you a little bit of a kick in the butt. Like, okay, I don't want to lose my ability to do whatever it is I do for a living, you know. I want to get better. And so that's also another thing that I think speaks to a lot of people and speaks to their fears as well. And then lastly, just the writing. You know, we know Wells is a great writer, but the ability to pull so many words together and there were a few sentences that were really long. And just the diction, because this was set in 1895, it was intimidating for like the first page. And then after you really get into it, you're able to follow the rhythm of his, of his talking, the time traveler's talking. And so he really is able to pull together so many topics and themes that really hit home in reality in under 100 pages. Who does that? And I'm able to pull so much information from it. It's just, people cannot do this. People cannot write like this, okay? So that's why I think it's maintained, along with the idea of time traveling, a lot of its popularity, because it's a quick read, but it's very meaningful. And there's a lot to take from it if you really look, It's something that bravely questions reality, but also pushes the limits of our imagination. And that's something that I encourage everyone to do. Push yourself outside your limits. Think of something different, something outside the box. Maybe question something a little bit and see what you get from there. It's certainly a book that I will reread again. And it's funny because a few years ago, I saw a couple clips of the 2002 movie, as well as the 1960 version. And I didn't want to watch the whole movie because I knew there was a book about it. So I was like, let me read the book first. But now I can watch those movies. They're probably on a streaming service somewhere, with a little more awareness. But this was definitely a great book. I totally enjoyed it. It was one of the classics that I got on sale I got it from a secondhand bookstore, so they're always on sale. I picked up a few classics. This one I think was maybe $4 or $5, but I got a couple for like $1.50. So if you're looking to get a foundation in reading or writing, I would recommend just buying a few of those books that have been around forever and that people always talk about, and see what all the hype's about. You won't be disappointed. These are certainly books that have stood tall against time, and the themes are still relevant. A lot of people have based their works off of this, so you can't waste your time on them. But I really enjoyed it, and I hope you guys enjoyed this review. Next week, as usual, I have no idea what I'm gonna do the episode on. I have a few books I'm reading right now. This one in particular, I will eventually be doing an episode on it. But it's called A Heartbreaking Work of Staggering Genius by Dave Eggers. I just started reading this. Eventually, the episode on Lovecraft Country by Matt Ruff will also be coming. So just stay tuned, and any suggestions, just let me know. But thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of A Idol Podcast, and I hope you all have a great weekend. Thank you.